Love and Infidelity. This is a story where
What
two
is
young
going
poor
on
couple
here?
fall in love and
It
get
is not
married.
what it looks like.
Amid all the love they share, the bride goes on cheating with her exes, yet the love remains. Main characters: Daniel, Mary. The first thing Daniel saw when he pushed open the bedroom door was Mary's shoes by the foot of the bed, not her sneakers, not the flats she wore around the house, but the red heels she only wore when she wanted to feel like a different woman. The second thing he saw was Marcus, sitting up too fast,
What is going on here? I was just leaving.
reaching for a shirt that wasn't even his. Daniel didn't shout. He didn't throw anything. He stood in the doorway of the house he had built with his own two hands, in the marriage he had built with everything else, and he said one word. Finally. Not how could you. Not why. Just finally. The word of a man who had been carrying a suspicion so heavy for so long that its confirmation felt almost like relief. Mary would remember that word for the rest of her life. She would replay it more than she replayed the affair itself, because, finally, meant he had known. It meant every dinner where he'd smiled at her, every business trip where he'd called to say goodnight, every anniversary card signed, "Forever yours." He had known, or suspected, and loved her through it anyway, waiting to see if she would come back to herself before it was too late. Marcus scrambled to pull his shirt over his head, and it caught on his elbow, and there was something almost comical about it. A grown man fighting his own sleeve in the middle of the worst moment of his affair partner's marriage. Mary sat up against the headboard, the sheet pulled to her collarbone, and she did not scream, did not cry, did not do any of the things she had rehearsed in the shower 100 times in case this exact moment ever arrived. She just stared at her husband's face, waiting for it to break, waiting for the fury she had spent 2 affairs bracing herself against. It never came. Daniel's face did something stranger than fury. It softened, almost, the way a man's face softens when a theory he has been carrying for a long time is finally, mercifully, confirmed. He looked at Marcus like he was looking at a piece of furniture that had been moved without his permission, an inconvenience, not a threat. He looked at Mary like he was looking at a woman he had been grieving for 2 years and had just, for the first time, stopped having to grieve in silence. "Get out," he said to Marcus.
Get out of my house.
Without raising his voice, without stepping further into the room. "Not because I'm angry. Because this isn't your house to be uncomfortable in." Marcus left without his other shoe. Nobody chased him down the stairs. The front door slammed on its own weight. And then it was just Daniel in the doorway and Mary on the bed they had picked out together 6 years earlier, in a store where the salesman had called them the cutest couple he'd seen all week. And Mary had laughed and squeezed Daniel's hand and thought, foolishly, that this was the version of their life where nothing else could go wrong. Finally, Daniel said again, quieter this time, almost to himself. And then he turned and walked down the stairs of the house his hands had built out of a solar charger and a stubborn refusal to accept the word no. And he did not come back that night, or the next, or the one after that. This is where their story ends. But to understand how 2 broke kids from 2 different continents built an empire out of nothing, and how that empire nearly buried them, you have to go back. Back before the mansion in the hills outside Houston. Back before Daniel's name was on buildings in Lagos and his companies had offices in 4 countries. Back to a 1-room apartment above a printing shop on Adeniran Ogunsanya Street, where a 19-year-old girl from Ohio walked in looking for a phone charger and walked out completely undone by a boy who owned nothing but believed in everything. Daniel Okafor grew up the second son of a mechanic in Mushin, one of the loudest, most crowded, most alive parts of Lagos. His father fixed engines that other mechanics had given up on. His mother sold pepper soup from a stand outside their compound that regulars swore was better than any restaurant in Victoria Island. Daniel was the boy who took apart radios just to understand how sound could live inside a box. By 14, he was fixing generators for the whole street. By 17, he had built his first solar charger from scrap parts, because NEPA, the power company everyone loved to curse, would cut electricity for days at a time, and Daniel got tired of doing his homework by candlelight. He never finished university. Not because he wasn't brilliant, his teachers begged him to apply for scholarships abroad, but because his father's hands started shaking too badly to hold a wrench, and someone had to keep food on the table. There was a specific afternoon Daniel would return to for the rest of his life whenever people asked him why he never resented the sacrifice. His father sitting on an overturned crate in the garage, staring at his own trembling fingers like they belonged to a stranger, saying nothing, because there was nothing a proud man could say about a body that had quietly started failing him. Daniel dropped out that same week. He didn't tell his father it was permanent. He let the old man believe it was a short leave, a semester off, because some truths are delivered slowly. He was 22, covered in engine grease 6 days a week, sleeping 4 hours a night, dreaming of something bigger than fixing other men's cars for the rest of his life. His older brother, Emeka, had already left for Port Harcourt to chase oil money and rarely sent anything home. His younger sister, Ngozi, was still in secondary school, and it was Daniel's garage income, unpredictable and thin, that kept her uniform pressed and her school fees paid. He never complained about it, not once, not even to himself in the privacy of his own head, because complaining felt like a luxury reserved for people who had other options. Daniel didn't believe he had other options. He believed he had a garage, a family, and whatever he could build with his hands in the hours after the garage closed. Those hours were where the real Daniel lived. After locking up at 8, he'd walk home past the roadside sellers packing up their tables, past the mosque calling the last prayer of the day, past groups of boys his age laughing over bottles of Fanta they'd stretched all evening because a full one was too expensive. He'd climb the narrow stairs to the room he shared with Ngozi and their mother, and by the light of a rechargeable lamp, because NEPA rarely gave them past 9, he would sketch circuit diagrams first, simple ones, copied from a second-hand electronics textbook a customer had left in his car and never come back for. Then more ambitious ones. Then, eventually, the beginnings of something he didn't yet have a name for. A way to store solar energy cheaply enough that an ordinary Lagos household, not just the wealthy compounds in Ikoyi, could keep their lights on when the grid failed them, which it did, reliably, every single day. He built his first working prototype from a car battery, a broken solar panel he'd fished out of another mechanic's scrap pile, and wiring he'd salvaged from 3 dead radios. It worked for exactly 11 minutes before it overheated and died, and Daniel sat on the floor of his mother's room at 2 in the morning laughing so hard he woke his sister up, not because it was funny that it had failed, but because for 11 minutes it had worked, and 11 minutes was more than anyone in his family had ever managed to steal from the dark. Mary Whitfield had never planned on Lagos. She'd never planned on much of anything beyond finishing her communications degree and maybe working at an ad agency in Columbus. But her college roommate's father worked for an NGO doing rural electrification projects across West Africa, and when a spot opened up for an unpaid summer intern to document the work, photos, social posts, a little writing, Mary, restless and broke and desperate for something that felt like her own life instead of the one mapped out for her by her parents, said yes before she let herself think twice. She landed in Lagos in June, the air thick and wet, the noise of the city hitting her like a wall the moment she stepped outside the airport. She was staying with a host family in Surulere. 3 days in, her phone charger frayed and died, and someone pointed her toward a small electronics repair stall 2 streets over. A boy, they said, who could fix anything. That boy was Daniel. She remembers the shop smelled like solder and orange peel. She remembers he didn't look up right away, hunched over a circuit board with a magnifying loupe pressed to one eye. She sat on an overturned bucket because there was nowhere else, and watched him work in silence for a while, before curiosity got the better of her. "What are you fixing?" "Somebody's whole life," he said, without looking up. "This man sells fabric. His phone is how his customers find him. If I don't fix this, he loses money tomorrow. That's a lot of pressure for a $5 repair. Everything is a lot of pressure when you have nothing behind it to catch you," he said, and something in the flatness of the way he said it made her stop treating the conversation as small talk. She asked him about the chargers stacked in the corner. Homemade, mismatched casings, hand-painted with a small sun logo. He explained, briefly at first, and then at length once he realized she was actually listening, that he was trying to build something bigger than repairs, a way to store solar power cheaply enough for ordinary households. He talked about amperage and battery cycles and things she didn't fully understand, and she found herself leaning forward instead of drifting off, because underneath the technical language was something she recognized instantly. A person who wanted his life to matter beyond the four walls he'd been born into. "What about you?" he said finally, setting down his tools. 10 minutes became 2 hours. "What are you running from that made my shop more interesting than wherever you're supposed to be?" The question caught her off guard, mostly because it was true, and mostly because nobody in Lagos had asked her anything that direct. "I don't know yet," she admitted. "I came here to take pictures of solar panel installations for a summer and write captions nobody will read. I don't actually have a plan after that." "Good," he said, and when she asked why that was good, he shrugged. "People with plans stop noticing things. You're still noticing things." She stayed for 2 hours. They talked about everything and nothing. About his solar chargers, about her non-existent plan for her life, about the pepper soup his mother made that he insisted she try before she left Lagos. He didn't have money. He didn't have prospects that anyone in her world would call impressive. What he had was a way of looking at problems like they were puzzles instead of walls, and a way of listening to her like her half-formed 20-year-old thoughts actually mattered.
So do you think it will actually work this time?
I'm just putting the finishing touches on it. This charger will be as good as new.
Perfect, then we can finally test out the panels.
When she finally stood to leave, he handed her charger back, fully repaired, and refused the money she tried to give him. "Come back when it breaks again," he said, and she laughed, because they both knew that wasn't really what he meant. She came back the next day with no broken charger at all, just a bag of oranges from the market, and set them on his workbench without a word. He looked at the oranges, then at her, and something passed between them that neither of them had language for yet. Not quite romance, not quite friendship, but the unmistakable feeling of two people who had, against every reasonable expectation, found something in each other worth returning for. She stayed in Lagos 3 more months than her internship required. Her parents called it a phase. Her mother, especially, was not shy about her disapproval. Long transatlantic calls where she asked Mary, again and again, if she understood what she was giving up, what kind of life she thought she'd have with a boy who fixes radios. Mary hung up on her twice. She told Daniel none of it, not at first, because she didn't want him to feel like a problem she had to defend. The 2 years between that first afternoon in the repair shop and their wedding day were not without their own quiet struggles. Mary's mother called weekly, sometimes daily, cycling through every argument she could summon. That Mary was throwing away her education, that she'd regret it the moment the initial infatuation wore off, that a girl from Columbus had no idea what she was signing up for in a country whose language, food, rhythms, and unwritten rules she'd known for barely a year. "You don't marry a place because you fell in love with the noise of it," her mother said once, a line Mary would remember bitterly for years. "You're not marrying Lagos, Mom," Mary had shot back. "I'm marrying Daniel." Her mother had gone quiet on the other end of the line, unconvinced, and the silence between them lasted for months afterward. Daniel had his own quiet battle to fight, not with disapproving in-laws, but with his own fear that he was asking Mary to sacrifice a life of comfort and opportunity for a future he couldn't yet promise her. There was a night, about a year into their courtship, when he sat her down on the narrow steps outside the repair shop and told her, plainly, that she should think carefully before committing to a man who owned nothing but a notebook full of half-finished ideas. "I can't promise you the life your parents wanted for you," he said. "I can't even promise you a life that looks like the one I want for you yet. All I have is this." He gestured at the notebook, at the small stack of prototype chargers, at the whole unglamorous shape of his ambition. Mary took his hand, the same hand still stained faintly with solder burns, and told him that she'd rather bet everything on a man who was honest about having nothing than spend her life with someone who promised her everything and delivered nothing real. It was, Daniel would say years later, the moment he stopped being afraid to ask her to marry him. They married 2 years after.
I promise to cherish you and stand by your side, always.
And I promise to love you for all of my days.
In a small church in Mushin with maybe 30 people in the pews, Daniel's family filling most of them, Mary's mother and father conspicuously absent, her younger brother the only Whitfield who flew out, and even he left after 2 days. Uneasy in a country he didn't understand, married to a sister he understood even less in that moment. Mary wore a dress her mother-in-law had sewn by hand because there was no money for anything from a boutique. A modest ivory gown with hand-embroidered lace at the collar that took Daniel's mother 3 full weeks of evenings to finish, working by the same rechargeable lamp Daniel had once used for his sketches. Daniel wore his only good shirt, pressed twice because he was so nervous he kept sweating through it, standing at the altar rehearsing his vows under his breath so many times that the pastor eventually leaned over and told him, gently, to just say what was in his heart when the moment came, because the paper he'd written them on was shaking too badly to read anyway. When Mary walked down the short aisle on the arm of Daniel's father, the older man's hands, though still trembling, steady enough that day to give away a daughter that wasn't biologically his, but who he'd come, in 2 short years, to love as completely as his own. The small church was so quiet that Daniel would later say he could hear his own heartbeat over the sound of her footsteps. He forgot every rehearsed word of his vows the moment she reached him. What he said instead, unscripted, staring at a girl who had left him oranges on a workbench with no explanation and no expectation of anything in return, was simple. I don't know what tomorrow looks like. I only know I want to build it with you, whatever it turns out to be. It wasn't polished. It wasn't the vow either of them had rehearsed. It was, Mary always said afterward, the truest thing anyone had ever said to her. If you're watching this and you've ever had to choose between the life everyone expected of you and the one that actually made you feel alive, drop a comment below and tell me which one you chose. Because Mary and Daniel's story was only just beginning, and the hardest choice either of them would ever make was still years away. They moved into a single room above the printing shop. 1 bed, 1 hot plate, 1 window that let in exactly 1 hour of afternoon light. Mary taught English part-time at a private academy for less money than she'd made babysitting back home. Daniel kept fixing cars and radios and generators by day, and by night, under a single bulb, he sketched circuit diagrams, business plans written in composition notebooks, an idea for affordable solar-powered inverter systems that could survive Nigeria's brutal, unreliable power grid, something that could actually change how ordinary families lived, not just some rich man's backup generator, but something a market woman or a schoolteacher could afford. Nobody believed in it at first. Banks laughed him out of their offices. No collateral, no degree, no connections. One loan officer, a man in a stiff blue suit with a framed university degree behind his desk, actually laughed out loud when Daniel slid his handwritten business plan across the table. "You want us to lend money to a mechanic with a notebook," the man said, not even bothering to lower his voice for the other customers in the waiting area. Daniel walked out of that bank with his composition notebook clutched to his chest like it was something that could still bleed, and he didn't tell Mary about the laughing for almost a week, because saying it out loud made it feel more true. His own father told him to be realistic, to be grateful for the garage, to stop chasing smoke. "You have a trade," his father said one evening, his shaking hands wrapped around a cup of tea Daniel had made him. "A trade is real. A trade feeds a family. This solar business, it's a young man's fantasy, and fantasies don't pay school fees." Daniel didn't argue. He simply nodded, the way he'd learned to nod at things he had no intention of abandoning, and kept sketching after his father went to sleep. It was Mary who believed first and believed loudest. She used what little of her savings remained, money her grandmother had left her, meant for a someday that was supposed to look like grad school or a wedding dress from a real bridal shop, and put it into Daniel's first batch of prototype inverters. $3,000. It felt like giving him her whole future. In a way, she was. "You don't have to do this," Daniel told her the night she handed him the folded bundle of naira she'd converted at a bureau de change that gave a terrible rate because she didn't know any better yet. "If this fails, that money is gone. I can't promise you it won't fail. You didn't promise me a guarantee when you married me," Mary said. "You promised me you. I'm betting on you, not on a guarantee." He kissed her then, in the doorway of the room above the printing shop, and neither of them said anything else about it, because there was nothing else that needed saying. The first batch of 18 units took him 11 straight days to assemble, working by the light of the same rechargeable lamp he'd used as a teenager, Mary beside him most nights sorting components into labeled tins from the pepper soup stand, learning the difference between a resistor and a capacitor by trial, error, and Daniel's patient, repeated corrections. Word spread through the neighborhood the way it always did in Lagos, not through advertisements, which they couldn't afford, but through the wife of a tailor who told the wife of a bread seller, who told her sister in the next compound over that there was a young couple selling small boxes that kept the lights on during blackouts, cheaper than a generator and quieter too. The first customer was a schoolteacher named Mrs. Adeyemi, who paid in installments over 6 weeks because that was all she could manage, and who cried a little the first night her daughter did her homework under a steady electric bulb instead of a flickering candle. Daniel kept the crumpled receipt from that first sale in his wallet for the next 15 years, long after the company had contracts worth millions, because it reminded him what the whole business had actually been for. The first 18 units sold out in 10 days, word of mouth alone, in a Lagos neighborhood tired of Nipa's broken promises. Daniel reinvested every naira. Mary handled what she called the parts he was too shy to do, talking to customers, writing the little pamphlets that explained the product, arguing with a supplier who tried to shortchange them on components because he assumed a foreign wife meant deep pockets. She learned to haggle and pigeon. She learned to sit through 5-hour waits at government offices for permits. She learned, in that first hard year, that love in Lagos was not soft. It was a thing you built with blistered hands, same as everything else. By their 3rd year of marriage, Okafor Energy Solutions had 11 employees and a real workshop instead of a garage. The old printing shop landlord, the same man who used to complain about the noise of Daniel's soldering iron at night, became one of his first investors, putting in a modest sum that he would later brag about at every family gathering for the rest of his life. Daniel hired 2 of his old schoolmates as technicians, a bookkeeper recommended by Mary's academy colleague, and a delivery driver named Tund who would stay with the company for the next 2 decades, eventually becoming head of logistics for the entire Lagos operation. Tund had shown up to the original garage looking for any kind of work at all, having just lost a job driving for a produce wholesaler, and Daniel, who had exactly enough money to pay one more salary and no real plan for what that person would do, hired him anyway on the strength of a single conversation about engines. I liked that he asked good questions, Daniel would say years later, whenever anyone asked why he'd taken such a risk on an unproven hire during the company's leanest year. A man who asks good questions about a problem he doesn't understand, yet is worth more than a man who pretends he already knows everything. The first real office move, from the garage to a proper 2-room workshop rented from a retired schoolteacher 3 streets over, became something of a legend among the company's earliest employees. Daniel insisted on carrying every single component of the first prototype batch himself, refusing help even from Tund, walking the 3 streets balancing boxes precariously while Mary walked alongside him carrying the ledger books, both of them laughing the entire way at how ridiculous they must have looked to anyone watching. A couple who'd have looked, to any outsider, like they were moving out of an apartment rather than launching what would eventually become a multinational energy company. The retired schoolteacher who owned the building cried a little handing over the keys, telling Daniel that his own late husband had once dreamed of starting a business and never found the courage, and that watching a young man actually do it gave her more joy than she'd expected a simple rental transaction to provide. By their 5th year, Daniel had a contract with the state government to supply low-cost solar kits to rural schools, a deal that took 8 months of meetings for rewritten proposals, and one memorable afternoon where Daniel wore Mary's father's old tie, mailed to them, strangely, as a peace offering after years of silence, because he owned nothing formal enough for the government building's dress code. The contract, when it finally came through, was worth more than Daniel's entire lifetime earnings up to that point. He came home and found Mary grading papers at their small kitchen table, and instead of saying anything, he simply set the signed contract down in front of her and watched her read it twice before she understood what she was looking at. She screamed loud enough that the neighbors came to check if something was wrong, and when they found out what had actually happened, the whole compound turned into an impromptu party that lasted until 2 in the morning, someone's cousin bringing a speaker, someone's auntie bringing a pot of jollof rice that appeared from nowhere. Everyone dancing in the narrow courtyard between the buildings like the government contract belonged to the whole street, and not just the couple who'd once lived above the printing shop. Growth was never a straight line. In their 4th year, a much larger, foreign-backed energy company entered the Lagos market with deep pockets and an aggressive undercutting strategy, offering solar kits at prices Daniel's small operation couldn't match without operating at a loss. For nearly 6 months, it looked as though everything they'd built might collapse under the weight of a competitor who could simply outspin them into irrelevance. Daniel spent those months barely sleeping, running numbers late into the night at the same kitchen table where he'd once sketched his first circuit diagrams, trying to find an angle the larger company had missed. He found it, eventually, in the thing the bigger company had never bothered to build: relationships. Where the foreign-backed competitor sold through faceless distributors and offered no real service after the sale, Daniel and Mary had spent years building genuine trust in the communities they served, showing up personally when units failed, training local technicians in every region rather than centralizing everything in Lagos. When the competitors' cheaper units began failing at a higher rate than expected, with no local support system to fall back on, customers returned to the name they'd trusted since the beginning. Okafor Energy Solutions survived the year not because it could outspend a giant, but because it had built something a giant, in its rush to dominate a market, had never bothered to understand. That people in Mushin and Surulere and villages far outside Lagos didn't just want a cheap product, they wanted to be treated like their trust mattered. Mary, who had spent those same 6 months personally answering customer complaints and training new hires in how to handle service calls with warmth instead of corporate detachment, would later say that period taught her more about the actual soul of the business than any of the flashier successes that came after it. The company had outgrown 3 different buildings by then, each move a small ceremony in itself. Daniel insisting on carrying the first prototype inverter, the one that had worked for 11 minutes before dying, to every new location, keeping it on a shelf in his office as a reminder of where the company had actually started. By their 7th year, the Okafors were no longer the broke couple sleeping above a printing shop. They had a proper house in Lekki, a driver, a name that meant something in rooms Daniel used to only fix cars outside of. Mary's mother, who had once called the marriage a phase over crackling transatlantic phone lines, flew to Lagos for the first time to see the house with her own eyes, and stood in the marble-floored living room for a long moment before finally saying, quietly, "I was wrong about him." It was the closest thing to an apology Mary would ever get, and she took it, because by then she understood that some people could only ever admit they were wrong through actions, never through words. This is usually where the story would end, the underdog triumph, the credits rolling over a montage of hard work paying off. But real life doesn't end at the mountaintop. It just changes what the climb looks like. Success did something strange to their marriage. It gave them everything they'd once prayed for, and it took away the one thing that had made those early years bearable: each other's undivided attention. Daniel started traveling constantly, chasing new markets, new investors, new government contracts across Ghana, Kenya, eventually the United States, as the company expanded into diaspora-focused energy investment. Mary, who had once been his partner in every decision, found herself increasingly a spectator to a business she had helped birth. She had her own projects. She'd started a foundation supporting girls' education in the communities Daniel's company served, but it never filled the particular hunger that came from being, for the first time in her adult life, alone in a big house with a husband who was more often on a plane than beside her. She would never say the marriage lacked love. It didn't. Daniel called her every night he traveled, without fail, even from time zones that made it 3 in the morning for him. He brought her small gifts from every city, not jewelry, but strange, specific things, because he paid attention: a spice she'd mentioned once, a book by an author she liked, a photograph of a sunset, because she'd told him once that sunsets made her feel like the world was still capable of being generous. He loved her the way he'd always loved her. He just wasn't there. There was a particular kind of loneliness that came with being married to a man everyone else needed. In Lagos, and later increasingly in Accra and Nairobi, and eventually the new U.S. office, Daniel's phone rang constantly, and every call felt urgent to somebody. And Mary learned to recognize the specific tightness in her husband's jaw that meant he was doing the math of how many people were depending on a decision he hadn't made yet. She stopped asking him to put the phone away at dinner because she got tired of watching guilt cross his face every time he had to explain, again, why he couldn't. She told herself this was simply what building something meant. She told herself a lot of things during those years, mostly late at night, alone in a bed too large for one person, doing the math on how many nights out of the last 30 he had actually been home before 9. Daniel's father died in the 6th year of their marriage. In his sleep, in the same modest house in Mushin, he'd refused to leave even after his son offered, repeatedly, to move him somewhere more comfortable. A man should die in the house where he raised his children, the old man had said, and Daniel, who understood stubbornness because he'd inherited so much of it, had eventually stopped arguing. The funeral was the largest gathering Mushin had seen in years. Hundreds of people. The old mechanic had fixed engines for over 4 decades, many of whom Daniel had never met. All of them with a story about a bill his father had quietly forgiven, a repair he'd done for free because a customer's child was sick, a kindness nobody had ever asked him to advertise. Mary stood beside Daniel through all 3 days of funeral rites, holding his hand through ceremonies she didn't fully understand the meaning of, learning on the spot how to properly greet elders, how to sit through hours of tribute without complaint, how to grieve a man in a language and tradition that wasn't originally hers but had, over 6 years, become hers anyway. It was, in some ways, the last truly unified season of their marriage before the slow drift began. Grief, paradoxically, had pulled them closer together rather than apart, the two of them clinging to each other through the disorienting weight of loss the way they'd once clung to each other through the disorienting weight of poverty. But grief also changed Daniel in ways that would matter later. His father's death lit a fire under him that nothing else ever had, a fierce, almost desperate need to build something permanent enough that it would outlast him the way his father's reputation had outlasted his relatively modest life. The company's expansion accelerated dramatically in the years that followed. New markets, new contracts, new countries. Daniel throwing himself into the work with an intensity that Mary, still grieving in her own quieter way, initially mistook for healing. It took years for her to recognize it instead as a kind of running. A man who couldn't sit still with his own grief, building an empire so large it left no room for stillness at all. Their house in Lekki, the same house that had once represented the impossible dream of 2 broke kids above a printing shop, started to feel less like a home and more like a beautifully furnished waiting room. Mary would set 2 places at the dinner table out of habit, then quietly put one back in the cabinet when Daniel's flight got delayed again. She threw herself into the foundation work, reading applications from girls across 3 countries who reminded her, in small painful ways, of the ambitious 19-year-old she'd once been, wandering into a repair shop with no plan for her life. But even meaningful work has a ceiling for how much loneliness it can absorb. At night, after the foundation emails were answered and the house had gone quiet, Mary would sit on the back terrace with a glass of wine she rarely finished, watching the lights of Lagos in the distance, and feel a hunger she couldn't name gathering somewhere just beneath her ribs, patient, old, and completely unbothered by how much she loved her husband. And Mary, this is the part she would spend years trying to understand about herself, had always struggled with a restlessness in her body that she didn't fully understand and had never told Daniel the full truth about. Before Lagos, before him, she'd had a string of relationships in college that ended the same way every time. She'd get bored, get tempted, get reckless, and blow things up before anyone got too close. There had been a boy named Trevor her sophomore year, sweet and steady and completely devoted to her, whom she'd cheated on twice within 4 months before finally ending it, unable to articulate even to herself why devotion felt, at the time, less like safety and more like a slow-closing door. There had been a professor's teaching assistant, inappropriate and reckless in a different way, a fling she'd pursued specifically, she realized only in retrospect, because it carried the exact right amount of risk to make her feel something her body had started to crave without her permission. She'd told herself marriage would be different, that Daniel was different, that the specific quality of his attention, steady, curious, endlessly patient, would finally be enough to quiet whatever it was in her that always wanted more, wanted new, wanted the electric jolt of somebody unfamiliar. For years, it was enough. The fear of losing him, the exhaustion of building a business from nothing, the sheer occupying force of survival, all of it kept the old restlessness dormant, buried so deep beneath the daily grind of counting naira and hand-soldering circuit boards that Mary genuinely believed, for the better part of a decade, that she had simply outgrown that earlier, more reckless version of herself. But once the survival part was over, once the house was big and quiet and Daniel was gone 4 days out of 7, the old hunger woke back up, stretching itself out in the empty hours the way a long dormant animal wakes slowly, testing its limbs, uncertain at first of its own strength. Mary noticed at first as nothing more than a vague dissatisfaction she couldn't name, an irritability during quiet dinners alone, a restlessness that made her reorganize closets at midnight, a tendency to linger a beat too long on the profiles of old flames whenever social media served them up. She didn't recognize it, not consciously, as the same hunger that had once cost her Trevor and half a dozen relationships before him. She simply thought she was bored, or lonely, or going through some vague midlife recalibration that everyone eventually experienced. It found Marcus before she ever managed to name it honestly, which was, in its own way, exactly how it had always operated, quietly, patiently, waiting for the precise moment her guard was lowest. Marcus wasn't a stranger. He was her college boyfriend, the one relationship in her past that had ended not because she got bored, but because she'd left the country and let the distance do what she didn't have the courage to do herself. Their breakup, back when Mary was 21 and packing for what she'd told everyone was a short summer internship, had been unresolved in the way only college relationships can be. No dramatic fight, no clean ending, just a slow fade as continents and time zones did the breaking up neither of them had the nerve to do out loud. Marcus had written her exactly one email after she settled in Lagos, asking if she was coming back, and Mary, newly infatuated with a boy who fixed radios, had never answered it. She'd thought about that unanswered email more than she ever admitted to anyone, a small unresolved thread she told herself didn't matter. He found her again 9 years later through a mutual friend's social media, a comment on an old photo that led to a message that led to catching up over the years. Nothing improper, at first, just two old friends comparing notes on the strange shapes their lives had taken. He told her about his failed marriage, an amicable divorce from a woman he said he'd married too young and for the wrong reasons. She told him, carefully, in the vague terms people use when they aren't ready to examine something too closely, that things with Daniel were good, just busy, the company growing fast, both of them stretched thinner than they used to be. He was in Houston now, doing well, running a mid-sized architecture firm, and when the Okafor's company opened its U.S. office there the same year, the coincidence felt, to Mary, like something closer to fate than it probably deserved to feel. Catching up in person felt harmless the first time he suggested it. Innocent, even. A coffee between old friends who happen to now live in the same city. Nothing more than closure on an unanswered email nearly a decade old. That, at least, was the story Mary told herself as she chose her outfit for that first coffee with more care than the occasion should have warranted, telling herself it was simply because she wanted to look put together, successful, like a woman whose life had turned out exactly as well as she'd hoped it would. It wasn't a coffee that undid her. It was the ease of it, the way Marcus remembered exactly who she'd been at 20, before Lagos, before the wife of a successful man identity she'd grown into, before she'd folded so much of herself into supporting Daniel's dream that she sometimes forgot what her own voice sounded like when she wasn't translating it for someone else. Marcus made her feel like Mary Whitfield again, not Mrs. Okafor. And God help her, she missed being just Mary. The first coffee turned into a second, and the second into a long walk along Buffalo Bayou that neither of them planned. And by the third meeting, Mary had stopped pretending, even to herself, that this was simply two old friends catching up.
Shall we take a walk?
I'd love to, let's go. I'm so glad we came here.
It is beautiful.
Marcus asked her questions Daniel no longer had time to ask. Not because Daniel didn't care, but because Daniel already thought he knew the answers, had known them for a decade, had stopped being curious the way new people are curious about each other. Marcus didn't know her as Mrs. Okafor, foundation director, wife of the energy magnate whose name appeared in business journals. He knew her as the 20-year-old who used to sneak out of her dorm to watch the sun rise from the roof of the science building. And talking to him felt like being handed back a version of herself she hadn't realized she'd misplaced. You seem different, he told her over their fourth meeting, a dinner this time, at a small Italian place near his apartment. Sadder maybe, or maybe just quieter. The Mary the first knew never stopped talking. The Mary you knew didn't have 3 companies depending on her husband making good decisions 6,000 miles away, she said, trying to make it sound like a joke, and failing. Is that what happened to her? She just disappeared into somebody else's life. The question landed somewhere Mary wasn't prepared for, and she didn't answer it, not with words. She reached across the table and put her hand over his, and neither of them said anything for a long moment. And later, walking back to his apartment in the humid Houston evening, she told herself this was still just two friends, still just conversation, still just the kind of harmless nostalgia that hurt no one. The first time she and Marcus slept together, she cried afterward in the bathroom of his apartment, silently, so he wouldn't hear, sitting on the edge of his tub with her knees pulled to her chest, staring at a stranger's shower curtain, and trying to understand how a woman who loved her husband as completely as she loved Daniel had ended up exactly here. She told herself it was a mistake, a one-time collapse of judgment brought on by loneliness and jet lag and too much wine. She told herself Daniel would never know, and that not knowing would be a mercy, and that she would never do it again. She did it again 3 weeks later. And then it became something she did every time Daniel traveled, a rhythm as regular and as guiltily comfortable as anything in her marriage. There was a specific choreography to it that she perfected without ever consciously deciding to. She would confirm Daniel's flight details, wait exactly 1 day after he left to make sure nothing had changed, then text Marcus a single word, free. That meant everything and revealed nothing to anyone who might have seen her phone. She hated the efficiency of her own deception almost as much as she hated the deception itself. She loved her husband. That was the part that made no sense to anyone who heard the story later. The part Mary herself could never fully explain even to her own therapist years afterward. She was not falling out of love with Daniel. If anything, guilt made her more attentive to him. She cooked for him more. She asked more questions about his day. She made love to him with an intensity that came from somewhere complicated and dark, a mixture of genuine longing and frantic penance. Once, after a particularly guilty week, she surprised him at the airport with flowers and his favorite meal waiting at home, and Daniel had held her so tightly in the arrivals hall that a stranger took a photo of them, thinking they looked like something out of a movie. Mary smiled for that photo with her whole face and hated herself completely, both at the exact same time. She was a woman split cleanly in two, and both halves were, in their own way, sincere. Marcus lasted 8 months before Mary ended it. Not out of moral clarity, but because he started pushing for more, started talking about her leaving Daniel, and the thought of actually losing her marriage terrified her in a way that cheating on it apparently didn't. She cut him off completely, blocked his number, told herself she'd learned her lesson, that this had been a fever that finally broke. For a year, it was true. She threw herself into her foundation work, expanded it into 3 countries, and for a while it felt like she'd found the thing that could actually satisfy the hunger, purpose instead of danger. Daniel noticed the change and was thrilled by it, told her he was prouder of her than he'd ever been, took her on a second honeymoon to the Amalfi Coast to celebrate 10 years of marriage. They stayed in a small cliffside hotel in Positano, the kind of place with no televisions and unreliable Wi-Fi, which Daniel had chosen specifically because he wanted, for once, to be somewhere his phone genuinely couldn't reach him. They spent their days doing almost nothing, long lunches that stretched into early evening, swimming in water so clear Mary said it felt like swimming inside a photograph, walking the steep, winding streets hand in hand like the 2 broke kids they'd once been, except now with enough money to actually enjoy being tired at the end of a long day instead of simply surviving it. Standing on a balcony over the water on their last night, the lights of the town glittering below them, and a bottle of wine neither of them had finished sitting forgotten on the small table between the 2 chairs, Daniel told her she was the best decision he'd ever made, better than any contract, any deal, any dollar the company had ever earned. 10 years ago I had a garage and a notebook full of ideas nobody believed in, he said, turning to face her fully, taking both her hands in his. Everything else, the company, the money, all of it, that's just proof of what I already knew the day you left oranges on my workbench, that you were worth building a life around. I'd trade every contract I've ever signed to keep having more days like today. Mary cried, and meant every tear, standing on that balcony believing, completely, that the old restlessness was gone for good, that whatever had pulled her toward Marcus had simply been a symptom of a lonelier, harder chapter of their marriage that they'd now, together, successfully outgrown. She told him, that night, that she'd never loved him more than she did in that exact moment. And she meant it with her whole chest, unaware that somewhere in the part of herself she still hadn't fully examined. The hunger hadn't been cured at all, only quieted, waiting, patient as ever, for the next long stretch of silence to wake it back up. It wasn't gone. It had just been waiting for the next long stretch of loneliness, the next version of Marcus. His name was Kevin, and he came into her life through the most mundane door imaginable. He managed the catering company Mary used for her foundation's annual gala. He showed up to the initial tasting with a clipboard and a crooked grin, tried to convince her that a Nigerian Texan fusion menu was exactly the kind of thing that would get the gala written up in the local paper, and made her laugh 3 separate times in a meeting that was supposed to last 20 minutes and stretch to 2 hours. He was funny in a way that disarmed her, unserious where Daniel was serious, spontaneous where Daniel's whole life now ran on calendars and quarterly projections. Kevin didn't know or care about supply chains or diaspora investment funds. Kevin wanted to take her to a dive bar with a bad cover band and dance badly on purpose, and the first time he suggested it, half joking, Mary surprised herself by saying yes. "You don't seem like a woman who dances badly on purpose," he told her that night, over drinks that were far too sweet and a cover band murdering a song she used to love. "I used to be," she said. "I think I forgot I was allowed to still be her." "Sounds like a tragedy," Kevin said, and pulled her onto the dance floor before she could think of a reason to say no. It felt, again, like being someone other than Mrs. Okafor, and once again, that feeling was the drug. But where Marcus had offered her the past, a return to who she'd been before Lagos, Kevin offered something more dangerous. A present tense that had nothing to do with either of her lives. A version of Mary that existed only in dive bars and late-night diners, and the particular freedom of a man who had absolutely nothing invested in the empire she'd helped build. This affair lasted longer than the first, over a year, and it was messier. Kevin wasn't content being a secret. More than once he showed up somewhere he shouldn't have, sent a text at a moment it could have been seen, pushed boundaries that put the whole architecture of her double life at risk. He texted her during a board dinner once, a message that lit up her phone screen face up on the table while Daniel was 2 seats away, and she'd had to laugh at something a board member said while simultaneously flipping her phone over with a casualness she didn't feel in the slightest, her heart hammering so loudly she was certain someone at the table could hear it. Another time, he showed up unannounced to a coffee shop near her foundation's office, not knowing, or not caring, that she was meeting a donor there, and she'd had to introduce him as a vendor from the gala, while praying the donor didn't notice the way Kevin's hand lingered a beat too long on her shoulder. There was a night, about 8 months into the affair with Kevin, when Mary nearly ended it on her own, before Daniel ever found out. She'd gone to a routine doctor's appointment and sat in the waiting room across from a mother helping her small daughter with a coloring book, the little girl proudly holding up a scribbled picture of what she said was my mommy and daddy holding hands. And Mary had excused herself to the bathroom and cried in a way that frightened her, gripping the edges of the sink, staring at a stranger's face in the mirror and barely recognizing the woman looking back. She'd texted Kevin that same night, "I can't keep doing this. This has to be the last time." He'd called her, upset, and they'd argued for the better part of an hour, Kevin accusing her of using him and discarding him whenever her conscience got inconvenient. Mary, too exhausted and too guilty to defend herself with any real conviction. She'd hung up believing, genuinely, that it was over. It lasted 11 days. On the 12th day, Daniel's flight to Ghana got extended by a week due to a contract dispute, and the particular quality of silence in the big Lekki-style house they'd built in Houston, the same silence that had once driven her to Marcus, pulled her back under before she'd even fully decided to let it. Mary lived those months in a state of low-grade panic she got frighteningly good at hiding. She started keeping 2 phones, one for her real life, one hidden in a shoebox at the back of her closet, its existence known only to Kevin and, she would later learn, to Daniel. She started rehearsing lies in the shower before she told them, running through possible questions Daniel might ask, and workshopping her answers with the same rigor she once brought to grant proposals. She hated herself with a thoroughness that never once stopped her from picking up when Kevin called. There were nights she sat in her car in the driveway, engine off, phone in hand, staring at his name on the screen and hating the part of herself that always, eventually, answered. There was a specific evening, roughly 18 months into the affair with Kevin, that Mary would later identify as the closest she'd come to being caught before Daniel ever chose to reveal what he already knew. Daniel had come home unexpectedly early from a same-day trip to Dallas. Walking into the kitchen just as Mary was hanging up her second phone, her back to the door, her voice still carrying the particular warmth she never used for ordinary calls. She spun around, heart slamming, and found him simply setting his laptop bag down by the door, seemingly unbothered, asking what smelled so good on the stove. "Just a friend," she said, sliding the phone into her back pocket with a casualness that took every ounce of composure she had left. From the gala committee. Vendor stuff. Sounded like a good conversation, Daniel said, and there was something in the flatness of his tone that made her stomach drop, though his face gave away nothing at all. He crossed the kitchen, kissed her forehead the way he always did, and asked about dinner as though nothing unusual had happened. Mary spent the rest of that evening in a state of controlled panic, replaying every word of the overheard half-conversation in her mind, certain that this was the night everything would finally collapse. It wasn't. Daniel said nothing else about it that night, or the next, or for months afterward. What Mary didn't know, what she wouldn't learn until much later, was that this was the exact night Daniel decided to stop hoping the affair would end on its own and start, quietly, deliberately, gathering the fuller picture he needed before he confronted anything directly. The vendor lie had been, to him, the final piece of confirmation he needed. Not that an affair was happening, which he already suspected, but that Mary had become someone capable of looking him directly in the eye and lying without so much as a tremor in her voice. That discovery frightened him more than the affair itself, because it meant the woman standing in front of him was no longer entirely the woman he thought he'd married, and he needed time, real time, to understand who she'd actually become before he decided what to do about it. If you've ever sat across from someone you love, certain they were lying to your face and terrified of what happens the moment you say so out loud, you already understand exactly what kept Daniel silent for 2 more years. Some truths are so large that speaking them feels like detonating your entire life. And there is a particular kind of courage, rarely talked about, in choosing to wait until you're strong enough to survive the blast. That vendor lie wasn't where the watching began, though. It had started nearly a year earlier, and it had taken him time to notice the small inconsistencies. A receipt from a Houston coffee shop on a day Mary said she'd stayed in, a friend's offhand comment about seeing her somewhere she'd said she hadn't been, the particular quality of guilt in her voice on certain phone calls, a texture Daniel, who had built an entire company reading rooms and reading people, eventually learned to recognize. The first real crack in his certainty came on an ordinary Thursday. He'd landed early from a trip to Nairobi, a full day ahead of schedule, and had planned to surprise Mary at home. Instead, he found the house empty, her calendar app showing nothing but a blank afternoon, and when he called her cell, she answered with a strange, breathless quality in her voice and told him she was just running errands. He didn't think much of it that day. He thought about it a great deal 3 weeks later, when a business associate mentioned, entirely in passing, that he'd seen Mary having what looked like an intimate lunch with a man near the Galleria on a Thursday afternoon. Daniel now realized matched the blank calendar square exactly. He hired no investigators. He confronted no one. Every instinct in him, the same instinct that had once made him want to storm into a bank and demand they take his business plan seriously, told him to demand the truth immediately. But Daniel had also learned, over 2 decades of negotiating contracts with men far more powerful than him, that confrontation without full information was a losing move. He decided, with the same cold discipline he applied to a difficult supplier negotiation, to gather facts before he made a single decision that couldn't be undone. He simply watched, quietly, with the same patient, methodical attention he brought to every problem in his life. He noticed the way Mary's phone, once left casually on countertops and nightstands, started disappearing into her purse, into drawers, into her hand at all times. He noticed a specific rhythm to her foundation meetings that only ever seemed to happen on the days he traveled. He noticed, most painfully, that she had become both more distant and more devoted at the same time, a contradiction he couldn't make sense of until, one particularly dark night in a hotel room in Ghana, He finally admitted to himself what he was actually looking at. Not a wife who had stopped loving him, but a wife at war with something inside herself that had nothing to do with how much she loved him at all. That distinction, subtle as it was, became the only thing that kept him from leaving her the moment he was certain. There was one night, roughly a year into his silent watching, when Daniel came dangerously close to ending the charade early. Mary had come home late from a foundation event that Daniel, having quietly checked, knew did not exist on any calendar he had access to. She'd walked into the bedroom smelling faintly of a cologne that wasn't his, her explanation about the event running long delivered with just enough hesitation to confirm everything he already suspected. He'd sat up in bed, the confrontation rising in his throat, fully prepared to demand the truth right then, consequences be damned. Instead, watching her get ready for bed with a practiced, guilty tenderness, the way she straightened his pillow before her own, the way she kissed his forehead even though she thought he was already asleep. Something in him hesitated. He recognized, in that hesitation, both the coward's excuse and something more complicated, a genuine fear that confronting her before he fully understood what he was dealing with might destroy something that still had a chance, however small, of repairing itself. He lay awake until nearly dawn that night, staring at the ceiling, feeling for the first time the full, corrosive weight of what he'd chosen to carry alone. And it was that specific night, more than any other, that he would later point to in therapy as the moment his patience, as he'd been calling it, had actually curdled into something closer to self-harm. Kevin's arrival into the picture, over a year later, confirmed something Daniel had quietly begun to fear, that this wasn't a single lapse he could forgive and move past in silence, but a pattern, something rooted far deeper than a lonely week or a moment of weakness. He found out about Kevin by accident, glancing at Mary's laptop screen while she was in the shower and seeing a calendar notification 4K, 2 p.m., that matched nothing on her official schedule. He didn't dig further that day. He simply filed it away, the way he filed away every other piece of the puzzle, and kept waiting, kept hoping, against all the evidence accumulating in his own careful memory, that she would find her way back on her own before he had to decide anything at all. What he found, watching quietly for 2 years, both broke his heart and complicated it beyond anything he'd expected. He didn't just see betrayal. He saw a woman at war with herself, the same woman who ran herself ragged for other people's daughters halfway across the world, who cried during his mother's old stories on the phone, who still, after everything, reached for his hand in her sleep like she had when they were young and broke and certain of nothing except each other. He didn't excuse what she was doing, but he couldn't make himself hate her for it, either, and that confused him more than the affairs themselves. He thought, for a long time, about walking away. He had the means now to build a new life without her, and God knew there were people in his circle, his mother chief among them, who would have told him he owed Mary nothing after this kind of disrespect. But every time he got close to deciding, he thought about the girl who'd walked into his repair shop with a dead phone charger and no plan for her life, who had put her grandmother's inheritance into his impossible idea because she believed in him before anyone else on earth did, including himself. He thought about that, and he couldn't make the math of walking away add up cleanly, not yet. So he waited. He watched. And he started, quietly, to build a different kind of plan, not a plan to punish her, but a plan to force the truth into the room where it could no longer hide, so that whatever happened next, it happened with everything finally visible. So he waited. He watched. And he started, quietly, to build a different kind of plan, not a plan to punish her, but a plan to force the truth into the room where it could no longer hide, so that whatever happened next, it happened with everything finally visible. He spent long nights sketching out that plan the same methodical way he'd once sketched circuit diagrams by lamplight, weighing every possible version of the confrontation, every possible outcome, trying to find the approach least likely to destroy what small chance of repair might still exist. He considered simply telling her he knew, sitting her down, and laying out 2 years of quiet evidence in a single devastating conversation. He rejected that approach almost immediately, worried that confronting her with a prepared case would feel to Mary less like an invitation to honesty and more like an ambush she'd have no choice but to defend against, sealing her into a corner rather than opening a door. He considered hiring a lawyer quietly, beginning the practical process of separation before ever raising the subject with her directly, giving himself the security of already having a plan in motion regardless of how the conversation went. He rejected that too, unable to shake the feeling that starting divorce proceedings before even attempting an honest conversation would make the ending a foregone conclusion rather than an actual choice. In the end, he decided on nothing at all. No engineered confrontation, no prepared speech, no lawyer waiting in the wings. He decided, instead, to simply let the truth surface on its own timeline, trusting that if he stayed patient and present, the moment would eventually arrive without his forcing it, and that when it did, both of them would finally be standing on the same honest ground for the first time in years. It was, in its own way, the least controlling decision Daniel had made in the entire 2 years of watching, and it was also the one that finally worked. That plan led him home 3 days early from a trip to Abuja. On a Tuesday afternoon, he wasn't supposed to be anywhere near Houston. The meetings had wrapped faster than expected, and Daniel had made the decision on a whim, texting nothing ahead, wanting, some part of him admitted later, to see, without warning, what a completely unannounced homecoming would actually reveal. It was not, strictly speaking, a trap. It was closer to a test he hadn't fully admitted to himself he was administering, the last piece of evidence he needed before deciding, once and for all, what to do with 2 years of careful, silent watching. The flight landed at noon. He didn't call the driver, choosing instead to take a cab from the airport, some instinct telling him to arrive without the usual fanfare of his own household staff announcing his return before he'd even walked through the door. The house was quiet when he let himself in, quiet in a way that felt, immediately, wrong. Not the ordinary quiet of an empty afternoon, but a specific, occupied quiet, the kind that comes from two people trying very hard not to make noise. He noticed the second pair of shoes by the door first, men's shoes, expensive looking, definitely not his own, and definitely not anything a delivery person would have left behind. He noticed the faint, unfamiliar cologne in the front hallway, something sharp and citrus-forward that he'd never once smelled in his own house. He climbed the stairs slowly, each step feeling, in retrospect, like it took a full minute, the 2 years of quiet watching collapsing suddenly into a single, unbearable present moment he could no longer defer. It led him up the stairs of his own house. It led him to the doorway of his own bedroom, to Mary's red heels on the floor, to Kevin scrambling for a shirt, to the single word Daniel said before he turned and walked back down those stairs without raising his voice once. Finally, he didn't sleep at the house that night. He checked into a hotel downtown, the kind of anonymous business hotel he'd stayed in 100 times for 100 different negotiations, and sat on the edge of the bed for hours without turning on the television, still in the suit he'd worn for a meeting that now felt like it belonged to another man's life. He thought about calling his mother and decided against it, not ready yet to hear her say the things she would inevitably say. He thought about calling Tund, his oldest employee and closest friend from the early garage days, and decided against that too, because some grief needs privacy before it can survive an audience. Instead, he did something he hadn't done since his father's funeral. He cried until his chest ached, silently, the way men from Mushin are taught to cry, without sound, without witnesses, his shoulders shaking in a hotel room 3,000 miles from the garage where he'd built his first prototype. Not for the affair itself, not exactly. He cried for the 2 years he'd spent quietly grieving a marriage he hadn't yet officially lost, carrying a secret nearly as heavy as hers, watching a woman he loved slowly disappear into someone he no longer fully recognized while he said nothing, hoping, every single day, that today would be the day she came back on her own. He thought about the printing shop. He thought about the oranges she'd left on his workbench, unasked, before either of them had said a single romantic word to each other. He thought about her handing him her grandmother's inheritance with a steadiness in her voice that had made him fall in love with her a second time, right there in that one-room apartment with the single hour of afternoon light. He wondered, sitting alone in that hotel room, whether the woman who had done that could possibly be the same woman he'd found upstairs that afternoon, and he understood, with a clarity that frightened him, that both of those women were real, and both of them were his wife, and he had no idea yet which one was going to win. Mary called 43 times that night. He watched the phone light up against the dark hotel comforter each time and let it ring out, his jaw tight, his hand hovering over the screen more than once before pulling back. Around 2 in the morning, she stopped calling and started texting instead. Not excuses, not the frantic lies she'd have reached for months earlier, but something closer to the truth than she'd ever let herself write down. I don't understand myself. I love you, and I have never stopped loving you, and I don't know how both of those things are true at the same time, but they are. I'm not asking you to forgive me tonight. I'm asking you to not disappear before I get the chance to actually tell you everything. A second message followed 20 minutes later. I know sorry means nothing right now. I'm not going to say it yet. I just need you to know I'm not running from this conversation, whenever you're ready to have it. He read every message twice. He set the phone face down on the nightstand around 4 in the morning and finally, exhausted past the point of grief, fell asleep still fully dressed on top of the covers. He answered none of them that night. 3 days passed before Daniel came back to the house. Not to reconcile, but to talk. Because whatever else he was a man who believed in facing hard conversations directly, the same way he'd once faced down bank managers who'd laughed at his business plan. Those 3 days had felt to Mary like standing at the edge of something with no bottom visible. She hadn't gone to the foundation office once. She hadn't answered a single call from anyone but Daniel, whose calls never came. She had blocked Kevin's number the morning after the discovery, deleting the second phone entirely, smashing it with a hammer from the garage, and throwing the pieces into 3 separate trash cans around the neighborhood, an act so theatrical and useless that she'd laughed and cried at the same time doing it, understanding even as she did it that destroying a phone couldn't undo what the phone had only ever been a tool for. During those first 3 unbearable days after the discovery, Mary called exactly one person besides Daniel, a close friend named Chioma, another Lagos-based expat wife she'd grown close to over the years, one of the only people who knew the full, unglamorous truth of the marriage's early poverty and could be trusted not to perform shock or judgment. Chioma listened to the entire confession without interrupting once, and when Mary finally finished, exhausted and raw, Chioma said only, "I'm not going to tell you what you want to hear, and I'm not going to tell you what you're afraid to hear either. I'm going to tell you the truth, which is that I don't know if he'll come back, and neither do you, and the only thing you actually have control over right now is what kind of person you're going to be regardless of what he decides." It wasn't comfort, exactly, but it was the clearest thing anyone said to Mary in those 3 days, and she held on to it, turning the words over and over in her mind, through every one of the 43 unanswered calls. When Daniel's key finally turned in the front door on the 3rd evening, Mary was sitting at the kitchen table where they'd once eaten instant noodles out of the same pot, because they couldn't afford 2 bowls. The same table, moved from apartment to this house, because Daniel had refused to replace it even when they could afford furniture that cost more than his father's entire garage. She looked like she hadn't slept in days. Maybe she hadn't. He didn't sit down right away. He stood in the kitchen doorway for a long moment, looking at her the way he'd looked at her from the bedroom doorway 3 days earlier, except this time there was no relief in his expression, only exhaustion. Finally, he pulled out the chair across from her and sat, folding his hands on the table between them like a man about to negotiate the hardest deal of his life. "I've known about Marcus since the 2nd year," he said, his voice level, almost too level, the voice he used in boardrooms when he needed to say something difficult without letting it shake. "I found out about Kevin 4 months ago." Mary's face went through something like relief and horror at the same time. Relief that the secret was finally, completely out. Horror at everything he must have carried, alone, while she'd continued destroying trust she didn't know he already knew was gone. Her mouth opened, closed, opened again before any sound came out. 2 years, she finally said, barely above a whisper. "You've known for 2 years, and you never said anything. You just kept living with me, kept sleeping next to me." "Yes." "Why?" The word cracked in the middle. "Why didn't you say something? Confront me? Leave? Scream at me? Anything? Why did you just watch?" "Because I wasn't ready to lose you," he said, and for the first time since he'd walked in, his composure slipped, just slightly, just enough for her to see the 2 years of exhaustion underneath it. "And I kept hoping you'd stop before I had to decide what losing you would even mean. Every week I told myself, this is the week she comes back. Every trip I took, I told myself, Maybe this is the last one. Maybe she doesn't need Marcus or Kevin or whoever comes after Kevin. Once I stopped traveling so much, I kept trying to find the version of this where it was my fault, Mary, because that version, at least, I could fix. It was never your fault, Mary said, and for the first time in the conversation, her voice found something solid underneath it. Daniel, look at me. This was never about you not being enough. I need you to understand that, even if you never forgive me for anything else. This isn't about you. Then what is it about? His voice rose, finally, cracking through the careful boardroom calm. Because I have spent 2 years trying to understand what I did wrong. I built you a foundation. I built you a house. I flew home early every chance I got. I called you every night from every country I was ever in. What was missing, Mary? Tell me what was missing, because I need to know if it's something I can actually fix, or if I've just been fixing the wrong thing this entire time. Mary was quiet for a long moment, tears finally falling freely, not the performative tears of guilt, but something rawer, older. Nothing was missing, she said. That's the part one can't explain to you in a way that will make sense, because it doesn't make sense to me either. I have a therapist I've never told the full truth to because I was too ashamed. I have a pattern, Daniel, that started long before I ever walked into your shop, and I spent our whole marriage hoping that loving you enough would be strong enough to bury it forever. It wasn't. And I let that failure become your problem too, without ever telling you it existed in the first place. And that's the part one actually can't forgive myself for. Not the affairs. The silence. The way I let you carry 2 years of not knowing why, when I knew exactly why, and was too scared to say it. Daniel sat back in his chair, absorbing that, his hands finally unclenching from where they'd been gripping the edge of the table. 2 men, Mary, he said quietly. Not one lapse. 2 separate people, 2 separate years, 2 separate versions of the same lie. Help me understand how someone does that while still loving the person they're lying to. Because I have turned that question over in my head every single night for 2 years, and I still don't have an answer that lets me sleep. I don't have a clean answer either, Mary admitted. The closest thing I have is this. Every time I was with either of them, some part of me was punishing myself for wanting it in the first place, and somehow that punishment made me want it more, not less. It's not logical. It's not something I can defend. It's just the truest thing I can tell you about what was happening inside me, and I know it doesn't fix anything. And I know you have every right to walk out that door right now and never look back. I'm not walking out that door, Daniel said, and the words seemed to surprise him as much as they surprised her. Not tonight, anyway. I don't know what happens after tonight. But I didn't come back here to end this in one conversation. I came back because I owe both of us more than a decision made from 3 days of silence and 43 unanswered phone calls. What followed was not a scene from a movie. No dramatic speech. No single moment of catharsis that fixed 10 years of accumulated silence and unspoken need. It was the hardest, most honest conversation of their marriage, stretching across that night and into the next day and the one after that. Mary told him things she'd never said out loud to anyone, not even her therapist, about the restlessness that had followed her since college, about the way she'd hoped marrying him would cure something in her that she now understood therapy, not romance, was actually built to address. She told him about the guilt that had eaten a hole through the middle of every good year they'd had. Guilt she'd never confessed, because confessing it would have meant risking the very thing she was terrified to lose. Daniel told her, in turn, about the 2 years of watching, the strange grief of loving someone while gathering evidence against them, the nights he'd sat in hotel rooms in other countries wondering if the whole marriage had been a story he'd told himself because he needed, more than he needed almost anything else in his life, to believe that the girl from Ohio had loved the boy from Mushin as completely as he'd loved her. There was no immediate forgiveness. Daniel moved into a rental apartment for 4 months, a sparsely furnished 2-bedroom near the office that felt, in its emptiness, like the exact opposite of the house he'd built with her, and both of them began individual therapy within the same week, though neither told the other until much later that they'd made the same decision independently. Mary, during those same 4 months, forced herself back into the foundation office after nearly 2 weeks of being unable to face anyone. The work, she found, was the only thing that made the days survivable, not because it distracted her from what she'd done, but because it kept placing her, again and again, in front of young women who reminded her of everything she'd almost thrown away without ever fully understanding why. There was a 17-year-old scholarship recipient named Blessing from a village outside Kumasi, whose entire application essay had been about her parents' 30-year marriage, about watching her father walk 4 hours each way to sell yams so her mother could keep a small tailoring business afloat during a drought year, about believing that kind of steady, unglamorous devotion was the most powerful force she'd ever witnessed. Mary read that essay 3 times before she could finish it without crying, not because it was about her, but because it was about everything she had once believed marriage could be, back when she was pouring her grandmother's inheritance into a stranger's impossible idea, because she believed, without a shred of doubt, that devotion like that was worth building a whole life around. She approved Blessing's scholarship personally, flew to Ghana to meet her when she otherwise had no reason to make that trip, and sat with the girl's parents in their small home for an entire afternoon, listening to a version of love that made no headlines and asked for no applause. And she came home from that trip with a clarity she hadn't expected, not forgiveness for herself yet, but a fierce, specific desire to become the kind of person capable of that steadiness, rather than simply admiring it in strangers. His therapist, an older man named Dr. Reyes, who had spent 30 years working with high-achieving men who'd built their identities entirely around never needing anyone, spent the first several sessions simply getting Daniel to admit out loud that watching quietly for 2 years hadn't been strength, as Daniel insisted, but a different kind of avoidance, a way of controlling an unbearable situation by refusing to let it become fully real. "You're describing surveillance as patience," Dr. Reyes told him once, gently but without softening the point. "Those aren't the same thing, Daniel. Patience waits for something to resolve on its own. What you were doing was gathering evidence for a decision you were too afraid to make." Mary's individual work went somewhere darker and older. Her therapist, a woman named Dr. Osei who specialized in attachment patterns, spent months walking Mary back through her adolescence, a period Mary had always described in vague, deflecting terms, until one session, almost by accident, she mentioned her father's business trips, the way her mother's mood would shift for days before and after them, the fight she'd overheard through a bedroom wall when she was 14 where her mother had used the word her in a way that made it clear it wasn't a stranger's name. Mary had never put those pieces together consciously before. She had simply absorbed, at 14, a lesson she never knew she'd learned, that love and betrayal lived in the same house, that instability was simply what intimacy eventually became, and that the only way to survive it was to become someone who created the instability herself, rather than someone who waited helplessly for it to arrive. "You learned that love was something you had to sabotage before it could sabotage you," Dr. Osei told her, and Mary had sat in stunned silence for the rest of that session, recognizing, for the first time in her adult life, the shape of the thing she'd spent 15 years running from without ever turning around to look at it directly. Eventually, cautiously, they began couples therapy together, a small office in a strip mall that felt almost comically ordinary for the size of the conversation happening inside it. The early sessions were brutal. Daniel spent one entire hour unable to speak at all, staring at a spot on the carpet while Mary tried, haltingly, to explain a pattern she was still only beginning to understand herself. Another session ended with Daniel standing up and leaving early, not because he wanted to abandon the process, but because something Mary said, a detail about Marcus she hadn't intended to share, about a weekend trip Daniel hadn't known about, had hit him somewhere he wasn't braced for. He came back the following week anyway. That, more than anything else, was what eventually convinced Mary that he meant to stay in the fight, even when the fight cost him something new every single week. There was one session, roughly a year into the process, that both of them would later describe as the true turning point, more than the day Daniel moved back in, more than any single apology. Their therapist, a soft-spoken woman named Dr. Kimura who specialized in infidelity recovery, asked them each to describe, without interruption, what they believed the other person actually needed from them going forward, not what they assumed, not what felt fair, but what they believed, in their gut, the other person genuinely needed. Mary went first. "He needs to stop believing this was his fault," she said, looking directly at Daniel instead of at the therapist, something she'd been coached to do but had struggled with for months. He keeps circling back to what he could have done differently. Traveled less, called more, been more present. And every time he does that, he's protecting himself from the harder truth, which is that nothing he did or didn't do caused this. I need him to actually believe that, not just say it back to me because it's the therapeutically correct thing to say. Daniel was quiet for a long moment before he spoke. She needs to stop believing she's fundamentally broken, he said finally, his voice rougher than usual. I've watched her, these past months, talk about herself like she's a faulty machine that finally malfunctioned in a way everyone always suspected it would. That's not what I see when I look at her. I see someone who inherited a wound she didn't put there herself, who's doing the hardest work I've ever watched anyone do to actually heal it instead of just hiding it better. If I only needed a wife who never made mistakes, I could have found that 100 times over in the last 15 years. I need my actual wife. The whole person, not a version of her that's been sanitized down to nothing but the good parts. Mary cried through most of the rest of that session, not from shame this time, but from something that felt, for the first time in over a year, dangerously close to hope. It took nearly 2 years before Daniel moved back into the house, and even then it happened slowly, almost shyly, a few nights a week at first, then most nights. Then, on a Tuesday neither of them marked with any ceremony, all of them. The first night he stayed over, 6 months into the reconciliation process, neither of them slept much, lying carefully on opposite sides of the same bed they'd once shared without thinking twice. Both of them acutely aware of how much distance still lived in the mattress between them, even as their hands eventually found each other somewhere in the dark, tentative, the way they had been tentative once before, a long time ago, in a very different bed above a printing shop. There was a test of that fragile trust about a year into Daniel's gradual return, one Mary hadn't planned and hadn't wanted. She ran into Kevin by pure accident at a restaurant downtown, a work dinner with catering vendors that she hadn't organized and couldn't have predicted he'd be attending. He approached her table before she saw him coming, and for one frozen, nauseating second, every old instinct in her body braced for the same choreography she'd once been so practiced at. The deflection, the private smile, the small, careful lie. Instead, she stood up, excused herself from her own table, and told him, in a voice steady enough to surprise herself, that she needed him to understand this was the last conversation they would ever have, that she wasn't angry at him anymore, but she also wasn't available to him in any capacity, ever again, and that if their paths crossed professionally in the future, she expected him to treat her with the same distance she intended to treat him with. Kevin, to his credit, didn't argue. He simply nodded, said he understood, and left. She told Daniel about the encounter that same night, unprompted, the words tumbling out of her almost before she'd taken her coat off, because withholding even a small, harmless detail felt, after everything, like a betrayal she was no longer willing to commit even in the smallest form. Daniel listened to the whole story without interrupting, and when she finished, he reached across the kitchen table, the same table, always the same table, and took her hand. "Thank you for telling me," he said. "Not because I needed proof. Because you didn't have to, and you did anyway." It was a small moment, unremarkable to anyone who hadn't lived through what came before it. But Mary would later say that single exchange did more to rebuild her own faith in the marriage than 100 therapy sessions combined. Because for the first time in years, honesty had cost her something in the moment and given her back something larger in return. It took longer than that before either of them would have called the marriage fully healed. But something changed in those 2 hard years that neither the money nor the mansion nor the company's international expansion had ever managed to change. For the first time since the early days above the printing shop, Daniel and Mary were building something together again, instead of simply living parallel lives inside a shared address. They went to therapy every week, together and separately, for years, long after most couples would have declared themselves finished with the work. Mary eventually spoke publicly, carefully, and without naming anyone, about infidelity as a symptom rather than a character flaw, using her foundation's platform to fund mental health resources for women navigating similar patterns. Work she said mattered to her more than any gala she'd ever thrown. She wrote, in one widely shared essay she published years later under a pseudonym before eventually attaching her real name to it, that she wanted other women trapped in the same contradiction she'd lived in, loving someone completely while betraying them repeatedly. To know that the contradiction had a name and a history and, crucially, a way out that didn't require losing everything to find it. During the 4 months Daniel lived in the rental apartment, he made the mistake, once, of telling his mother the truth over the phone. He hadn't meant to. She'd simply asked, in her direct way, why he sounded like a man who hadn't slept properly in weeks, and Daniel, exhausted past the point of maintaining his usual composure, told her everything. His mother was quiet for a long time on the other end of the line, long enough that Daniel thought the call had dropped. "You will come home," she finally said. Not a question, not even really a suggestion. A verdict, delivered in the same tone she'd once used to tell a teenage Daniel that he would finish his homework before he touched another radio. "Mama, it's not that simple." "I did not say it was simple. I said you will come home." She paused. "Daniel, listen to me. Your father was not a perfect man. I loved him for 40 years, and I could tell you things about those 40 years that would make you understand marriage is not a business contract where one broken clause ends everything. I am not telling you to forgive her. I am telling you that you owe it to yourself and to the 10 years you already built together to find out whether this is the end of something or the middle of something, before you decide it is the end." Mary's younger brother, the same brother who had flown out for their original wedding and left uneasily after 2 days, reached out to her during that same difficult stretch, the first real conversation the two of them had shared in years beyond obligatory holiday calls. He'd heard a vague, second-hand version of events from their mother and, to Mary's surprise, hadn't called to judge her, but simply to ask if she was okay. "I always felt guilty," he admitted during that call, "for leaving early at your wedding. I was young, and Legos scared me, and I think some part of me resented you for choosing a life so different from what we grew up with. I never told you that. I'm telling you now because I don't want to be the kind of brother who only shows up when things are easy." Mary cried through most of that call too, grateful in a way she hadn't expected to be for a relationship she'd assumed had quietly faded past the point of repair. His sister Ngozi, when she found out, was far less measured. She flew from Lagos to Houston on 48 hours' notice, showed up at Daniel's rental apartment with a suitcase and a fury that reminded Daniel of exactly why she'd once threatened to fight a boy twice her size for teasing him about his stutter as a child. She sat across from him at his small rental kitchen table, a folding table, nothing like the one Mary had kept from the printing shop days, and told him, in no uncertain terms, that whatever he decided, he was not allowed to decide it out of pride, and he was not allowed to decide it out of fear either. "You built an entire company on refusing to accept easy no's, Daniel," she told him. "Don't accept an easy no from your own marriage just because it would be simpler than doing the actual work." The company did not pause for any of it. Okafor Energy Solutions was, by that point, negotiating its largest contract yet, a partnership with a Texas-based renewable energy fund that would allow Daniel to bring affordable solar infrastructure to underserved communities across 3 additional West African countries, a deal worth more than everything the company had built in its first decade combined. Daniel found himself in the surreal position of sitting across negotiating tables from investors who saw him as the embodiment of a success story, a man who had built an empire from nothing and clearly had his life together, while going home each night to a rental apartment with 3 folding chairs and a mattress still wrapped in its original plastic because he hadn't found the energy to properly set it up. Word never officially spread through the company. Daniel made sure of that, keeping the details of his personal life as carefully guarded as any trade secret. But the people closest to him, the ones who'd known him since the garage days, could tell something was deeply wrong long before he ever confirmed it. Tund, who had driven the company's very first delivery van and now ran logistics for 4 countries, showed up at Daniel's rental apartment one evening uninvited, carrying a pot of his wife's Ifo Riro because, he said simply, a man living out of a rental apartment with 3 folding chairs is not eating properly, and I refuse to let that happen to you, whatever is going on. He didn't ask what was going on. He simply set the pot down, made sure Daniel ate a full plate in front of him, and left without pressing for details he understood weren't his to demand. Adiz, the sharp young head of legal who had pulled Daniel aside during the near-disastrous negotiation, eventually became one of the very few people at the company Daniel confided in directly, mostly because her clear-eyed bluntness was, paradoxically, Exactly what he needed during a period when everyone else in his life seemed to be tiptoeing around him with a delicacy that made everything worse. I'm not going to pretend I understand exactly what you're going through, she told him over a working lunch neither of them finished. But I will say this. I've watched you rebuild broken supply chains, broken contracts, an entire company from a garage with no collateral. You don't strike me as a man who gives up on things just because they got difficult. I don't know what's right for your marriage. I just know that's not usually how you operate. Daniel never forgot that lunch, not because it told him what to do, but because it reminded him, at a moment he badly needed reminding, of who he actually was underneath the exhaustion. He nearly lost the deal twice during that period, not because the numbers didn't work, but because his mind kept drifting mid-meeting to a version of the future he could no longer picture clearly. His head of legal, a sharp young woman named Adiz who had joined the company 5 years earlier and had quietly noticed something was wrong with her usually unshakable boss, finally pulled him aside after the second near miss. Whatever this is, she told him, in the blunt way he'd hired her for in the first place, you need to either handle it or hand off this deal to someone who can focus. I say this with respect, sir. I've watched you build this company out of nothing. I'm not going to watch you lose the biggest deal of your career because you're pretending you're fine when everyone in that room can see you're not. Daniel took 2 weeks away from the negotiation after that, the first real time off he'd taken in over a decade, and came back to the table clearer-headed, though not because anything about the situation with Mary had resolved, only because he'd finally admitted to himself, out loud, in Dr. Reyes's office, that trying to hold 2 separate crises without acknowledging either of them was a strategy destined to fail both. The deal closed 4 months later. On the same week, Daniel and Mary had their first genuinely hopeful couples therapy session, and Daniel would later say that he'd never been less able to enjoy a professional triumph in his life, because the 2 milestones felt, in his mind, permanently tangled together, proof that he could rebuild a business from a repair shop, but no proof yet that he could rebuild a marriage from the wreckage of 2 years of silence. He didn't tell Mary about either conversation for a long time. When he eventually did, months into their reconciliation, she cried harder hearing about his mother's grace than she had during almost any other part of the process, because some part of her had assumed, wrongly, that Daniel's family would want her gone, would see her exactly as her own mother had once seen him, an unworthy risk to something precious. Daniel, for his part, learned to build boundaries around his travel that he'd once thought impossible for a man running an empire. Fewer trips, more video calls, a leadership team he trusted enough to actually delegate to instead of doing everything himself, the same way his father had once refused to trust anyone else with an engine. He learned that the empire he'd built could survive him being present for his own life, something the boy from Mushin, raised to believe worth was measured entirely in hustle, had never once considered possible. Somewhere in the second year of their reconciliation, Mary made a trip back to Ohio she'd been avoiding for the better part of a decade, not to confess the affairs, which she never fully did to her mother, but to finally ask the questions about her father's own infidelity that she'd spent 30 years too afraid to voice out loud. Her mother, older now, softer in ways Mary hadn't expected, answered every question with a rawness that surprised them both, describing years Mary had only ever half understood as a teenager overhearing arguments through bedroom walls. I stayed because I loved him, her mother said simply, sitting across a kitchen table in the same house Mary had grown up in, the same house she'd once been so desperate to leave behind. People act like staying after something like that makes you weak, or foolish, or like you don't respect yourself. Nobody ever tells you that sometimes staying is the hardest, bravest thing you'll ever do, harder by far than leaving would have been. She paused, studying her daughter's face with an intensity Mary hadn't seen from her in years. Why are you really asking me about this now, Mary? After all this time? Mary didn't answer directly. She simply reached across the table and took her mother's hand, the way Daniel had once taken hers across their own kitchen table, and said only, I needed to understand where the pattern started. I think I finally do. Her mother didn't press further, but something shifted between them that visit, a closeness neither of them had felt since Mary was a little girl, long before Lagos, long before either of their marriages had been tested in ways neither of them had ever expected to survive. On the 3rd anniversary of the day Daniel found the red heels by the bed, a date they had, without ever discussing it explicitly, started quietly marking each year, not to commemorate the wound, but to measure the distance they'd traveled away from it. They renewed their vows in a small ceremony at the same church in Mushin where they'd married nearly 2 decades earlier. It wasn't a grand affair. Daniel's mother, older now and moving more slowly, sat in the front pew in the same seat she'd occupied at the original wedding. Ngozi stood as Mary's witness this time, a role that would have seemed unthinkable to anyone who remembered how furiously protective she'd once been of her brother, but which felt, by then, like the most natural thing in the world. Mary wrote her own vows for the second ceremony, something she hadn't done the first time. Too young and too swept up to know yet what she actually wanted to promise a person for a lifetime. "The first time I married you," she said, her voice carrying across the small church, "I promised you forever without understanding what forever actually costs. I understand it now. Forever costs showing up on the days you don't feel like showing up. It costs telling the truth when the truth is going to hurt someone you love. It costs choosing the same person over and over, even after you've seen the absolute worst version of yourself reflected back at you by your own choices. I am not the same woman who walked into your repair shop looking for a phone charger. I've done things that woman would not have believed herself capable of. But I am, finally, someone capable of the kind of steadiness I once only admired from a distance in other people's marriages. I promise you that steadiness now, not because I'm certain I'll never fail again, but because I finally understand that love isn't the absence of failure. It's what you build in spite of it." Daniel, never a man of many public words, kept his vows shorter, but no less considered. "I told you once that people with plans stop noticing things," he said, and Mary laughed through fresh tears, remembering the exact conversation from the repair shop 2 decades earlier. "I had a plan for this marriage once. It didn't survive contact with the truth. What survived was something better than a plan, a decision, made new every single day, to keep choosing you. Flaws and history and all, the same way you once chose a boy with nothing but a notebook full of circuit diagrams and no reasonable expectation of success. I don't need you to be perfect, Mary. I need you to keep choosing this, the way I'm choosing to keep believing you will. That's the whole vow. Everything else is just details." They are still married today. Not because the affairs didn't happen. They happened, and they left scars that both of them carry quietly, visible only in certain small habits. The way Daniel still, 7 years later, sometimes checks his phone twice before believing an answer. The way Mary still flinches, almost imperceptibly, when someone jokes about business trips. But they are married because 2 broke kids who once believed in each other before either of them had a single reason to be believed and decided, even after the worst thing either of them had ever done to the other, that the belief was still worth fighting to keep. Daniel likes to say now that the real success of his life was never the company, never the buildings with his name on them, never the 11-year-old solar charger prototype that turned into an international energy business, now powering homes and schools across 5 countries. He says the real success was staying in the room during the hardest conversation of his life, instead of walking out the way everyone told him he had every right to. He'll tell you, if you ask him at the right moment, that building Okafor Energy Solutions from nothing taught him how to solve problems, but rebuilding his marriage taught him something the business never could, that the hardest, most important things a person ever builds are rarely the ones that come with a signed contract or a ribbon-cutting ceremony. They're the quiet, unglamorous, daily decisions nobody applauds, made in kitchens and therapy offices and hotel rooms at 2 in the morning, when nobody is watching and there's no deal on the table except the choice to keep showing up anyway. Mary says something similar, in her own words, that she spent so many years chasing a feeling that made her feel alive, without understanding that the life she already had, the one she'd almost thrown away twice, was the realest thing she'd ever built. She'll tell you now, sitting on the same terrace where she once sat alone with an unfinished glass of wine and a hunger she couldn't name, that healing didn't look like the feeling disappearing entirely. It looked like learning to recognize it the moment it arrived, understanding exactly what it was asking of her, and choosing, deliberately, consciously, again and again, not to hand it the keys. She still goes to therapy. She probably always will. She stopped treating that as a failure and started treating it as maintenance, the same unglamorous, necessary work Daniel's father once did on other people's engines. Not because something is always broken, but because the things that matter most require tending whether they're broken or not. Tund, who still runs logistics for the company decades after driving that first delivery van, likes to tell new employees at the Lagos office a version of the story that leaves out the affairs entirely and focuses only on the 11 minutes the first prototype worked before it died. Everything this company is, he tells them, started with something failing and two people who refused to let the failure be the last word. He doesn't know how precisely that lesson would come to describe the marriage too, not just the business, but Daniel, when he overhears it, never corrects him. They don't tell the full story often, and when they do, it's not for sympathy, and it's not to excuse what happened. It's because somewhere out there is another Daniel, watching quietly and not knowing whether to stay or go, carrying a secret that feels too heavy to name out loud, even to the people closest to him. Somewhere out there is another Mary, hating herself for a hunger she doesn't understand and can't seem to outrun, convinced that the love she feels and the damage she causes cannot possibly both be real at the same time. And if their story can do anything for either of them, Daniel says, let it be this. The ending isn't written the moment the truth comes out. It's written in everything that happens after. In whether two people are willing to do the unbearably hard work of finding their way back to each other, or whether they let the worst moment of their story become the only one that matters. These days, if you visit the Okafor house outside Houston, you'll find a small framed photograph on the mantle that surprises most first-time guests. Not a photo from their wedding. Not a photo from any of the company's ribbon-cutting ceremonies that made regional business news, but a grainy, poorly lit photograph of a small repair shop on Adeniran Ogunsanya Street. Workbench cluttered with wires and half-finished circuit boards. A bag of oranges sitting conspicuously in the corner of the frame. Daniel took that photo himself, years after the fact, on a trip back to Lagos when he discovered, almost by accident, that the shop still stood, now run by a young apprentice who had no idea the elderly landlord's most famous former tenant was standing quietly in his doorway. Mary asked him once why, of every photo they could have chosen for the mantle, their wedding, their vow renewal, the ribbon cutting for the company's 100th rural school installation, he'd chosen that one. Daniel thought about it for a long moment before answering. Because everything that actually mattered started there, he said. Not the money, not even the marriage, really, the believing. You believed in a stranger with a notebook before you had a single good reason to. I think some part of me needs to look at that photo every day and remember that the belief is the thing that has to survive, no matter what else happens to test it. The rest is just details. It would have been easier, in 100 different ways, for this to have ended the ordinary way these stories usually end. A locked door, a lawyer's office, two lives that once shared a table above a printing shop pulling apart forever, each of them telling a slightly different version of the same story to anyone who would listen. Nobody would have blamed Daniel for choosing that ending. Nobody would have called Mary a villain for expecting it. But somewhere between the girl who left oranges on a workbench and the man who whispered, finally, from a bedroom doorway, something had been built that neither of them was willing to let a single terrible chapter define completely. Not because the pain wasn't real, but because the love underneath it, complicated and imperfect and hard one, had always been real too. If you made it this far, you already know this wasn't a simple love story. It was two people, flawed in different ways, wounded in different ways, choosing, again and again, imperfectly, painfully, without any guarantee it would work, to choose each other. Tell me in the comments, do you think Daniel made the right choice by staying? Or should he have walked away the night he found those red heels by the bed? And if you were Mary, sitting in that empty house for 3 days waiting to find out if your marriage was over, what would you have said to him if he'd finally walked back through that door?